Hey guys, and welcome to episode 41 of the Revive Yourself podcast. Here we go.
If you're struggling with gut issues, such as gas, bloating, constipation, diarrhea, indigestion, heartburn, and want to finally be able to eat the foods you love without the crippling after effects, then don't forget to head over to reviveyourself.co and pick up your free copy of The Healing Health Paradigm today.
So guys, welcome to episode number 41 of the Revive Yourself podcast. Hope everyone's well, hope you're enjoying the show so far and even the little daily episodes I've been trying to put in. We're going to be focusing from now on a lot more on gut health. We're going to be doing interviews with everyone still, but how it affects the gut, because the gut is the key aspect when it comes to health. All the organs are important, but once you get the gut working, everything else seems to fall in place, and when the gut's not working, it causes catastrophic problems. So we're going to be doing a lot of different episodes, but we're going to be focusing a lot on how this all impacts the gut. So it's going to be something we're going to concentrate a lot on. And as if you haven't already, guys, head on over to www.reviveyourself.co if you're struggling with gut issues and you want to join our free mini course. You can do so on our website, which a lot of people have been getting great results from, and we're getting a lot of good emails through actually from people saying they really appreciate that their courses are free, and that's not a problem. We're trying to help as many people as possible, because I know at the end of the day, guys, that I'm a professional nutritional therapist and holistic health coach, and obviously I do need one-to-one clients, but I know not everyone can afford to work with me, so I like to give them out as much free content information as possible. It's one of the things. But obviously, same as everyone, we need to work with people one-to-one. For me to be able to put this information out for free, I do need to have clients, etc. But I learned a long time ago that I want to change the perception of everyone when it comes to health and regenerating health. And it's not about fighting disease. It's like not I've got this or I've got that. It's just because the way we treat our body, that's what happens. As I said before, modern genetic predisposition plus modern lifestyle equals chronic illness, and I just want people to understand that. That's why I put all this content out for free. Anyway, moving on. Today's episode is with someone who I've been listening to for a long time on different shows. He's someone I wanted to get on for a long while, and that is Chris Masterjohn. Now, we're going to be talking all about cholesterol. So we're going to be talking about is there really any good or bad cholesterol? I mean, do you need a cholesterol lowering drug? Does cholesterol actually cause heart disease? Well, we'll be talking about all this with Chris. And Chris is pretty impressive. I mean, he earned a PhD in Nutritional Sciences from the University of Connecticut in the summer of 2012. And then from September 2012 to August 2014, he served as a postdoctoral research associate in the Comparative Biosciences department at the College of Veterinary Medicine at the University of Illinois. And finally, he served as an assistant professor of health and nutrition sciences at Brooklyn College, part of the city or the University of New York. So he's covered a lot when it comes to nutrition and health, and we actually start with about his journey into the health industry, because it wasn't where he actually started and why he got into it. So we also cover a lot about cholesterol, so anyone who's worrying about cholesterol, if they need a statin, etc., we'll be going through that in today's show. So without further ado, here he is, guys. Here's Chris. Enjoy the show, and I'll see you on the other side. Hey guys, and welcome to episode 41 of the Revive Yourself podcast. Today we've got a very special guest, Chris Masterjohn, and we'll be talking all about cholesterol. How you going today, Chris?
I'm doing well. How you doing, Ryan?
Yeah, I'm doing really well. Just actually, one of our last guests had on, Anne Margolis, talking about sweet home birth. She was a New Yorker as well. And how's New York today? Because it seems a lot of the guys that are getting on recently have all been from New York.
It's great. It's a little chilly today, but that's how I like it.
Yeah, I was saying to Anne as well, some of my favourite times of the year actually, fall and spring. It's just got quite a nice... summer's always cool, but it can get too hot, and I know it can get extremely hot in New York, but spring and
Oh
fall.
yeah, well in the city, because the concrete and the pavement just bakes in the sun and holds on to the. It doesn't cool at night very well here because everything retains the heat and off gases it at night.
Yeah,
So
it's a cool city in New York. Yeah, I can imagine. I was there last. I said before, I was there last Christmas, and it wasn't as cold as what I thought it would be. I was quite thankful for that. It was only about -5, -10, which was good. Whereabouts in New York are you? You in New York? New York? You're in
I'm in
Manhattan?
Queens.
Queens. Oh, okay.
No, I'm in Queens. Yeah.
Right, nice. So it's yeah, very very close to Manhattan. So Chris, we've been lucky to get. I mean, we've been lucky for the audience out there. We've been lucky to get Chris on. Been trying to get him on for a little while because he's someone when it comes to health issues in general. He's an expert in a lot of different areas. But when it comes to cholesterol, he's someone I really wanted to get on the show because heart disease is something. Well, it's the number one biggest killer, just above cancer and above medical intervention. And it's a topic that when it's addressed, it has many. Well, in the health industry, we'll talk about how saturated fat's good for your heart. When topics of statins come up, people are always asking, should I be on them or not? Get a lot of questions about it. So hopefully Chris will be able to answer a lot of these for us today. So Chris, I know you said this for the audience out there. I'm going to do a little bio before the show for you anyway, but for the audience out there. You did your undergraduate in history in the University of Massachusetts. So how did you then get into health coaching and becoming sort of a health expert, especially on the topic of cholesterol?
Well, I'd always been interested in health as a hobby back to my teenage years. What happened in college was while I was doing that history degree, I experimented with veganism. The experiment ultimately failed, and I just had a dramatic decline in my health that I was able to reverse through diet. And when I had that experience, I came to a much more profound appreciation of the role of nutrition in real life health changes and decided to pay that forward somehow. So my initial plan was to go to medical school, but then as I was with a history degree, obviously I have to do a lot of undergraduate science classes to get into medical school. While I was doing that, I decided to go into research instead. So I got my PhD in Nutritional Sciences, and I went the traditional route of going from PhD to postdoc to full-time tenure track faculty for a few years. But after about 2 years of being an assistant professor of health and nutrition sciences in a university, I decided to leave academia and go into business myself. So right now I do a mix of consulting, research, and education, all based out of my apartment, actually. So.
Yep. No, it's very similar to what I do as well. Sometimes it's supposed to be working for yourself. So you've been working for yourself now for how long?
Full time since January of this year.
Oh, okay, awesome. And you said you did your nutrition and science, nutrition scientist. Was it in biochemical and molecular nutrition? Was that correct?
I think that's fair. I mean, ultimately, there's no specialty that's written into my diploma, but I think it's fair to say that I focused on that branch of things more or less.
Yeah. Anyone who's come across Chris knows that he can get very technical, and for a lot of people, it can be the information put out can be like, oh my god, it can go over people's heads. So what we're going to try and do today, and with your help, Chris, we're going to try and make it as info friendly as possible. And if it does get a bit confusing, then I'll just try and lay it out in layman's terms as best I can. But I've heard you talk before, Chris, and I think the first time when you said you come across your own health issues, the first person or people that you seem to look into and follow to get your own health right was Weston Price. Is this correct?
That's correct.
Yeah. And so what was it about his work? If those of you out there, our audience will know Dr. Weston Price and his work. What was it about his work that differed from what you'd heard, and what was it that you did that allowed you to your health to for you to regain your health and get your health back? Because I know you said before, I've heard you speak about you used to suffer with anxiety, and I think you had a few dental issues. Is this right?
Yeah, I never had an expectation that the anxiety would be remedied by diet. What happened was the dental issues drove me to Weston Price's work. So I went to a dentist while I was vegan, or while I was on the cusp of transitioning out of veganism. But I was still mostly vegan, and I had been vegan for the preceding year. And I found that I had over a dozen cavities and needed 2 root canals in this one single session. So I had been, I had probably had 6 or 7 cavities when I was a kid, and that dampened down over time. Maybe I had 1 or 2 when I was a teenager. So I'd always been cavity prone, but I had never, ever, ever had that anything like that. I don't think I've ever had more than 2 cavities discovered in a session, and that would be considered a lot up to that time. So to have over a dozen cavities in a single session and need 2 root canals, which I'd never needed before, was just a dramatic worsening of my predisposition to tooth decay. And it so happened that while I was in I was in my 4th out of 5 years undergrad, I was working in the dining hall on campus, and my boss gave me a pamphlet about raw milk that he got from a farm that he bought raw milk from. And that pamphlet talked about Weston Price's research. And Weston Price I consider him a pioneer in nutritional anthropology, and I think his work has much more significance than just tooth decay, but he was by trade a dentist and a dental researcher. So that was the centrality of his focus. And so naturally, this pamphlet talked about how he studied these non-modernized people who had immunity to tooth decay. And I was like, immunity to tooth decay? Like, I want in on that. So I just read Weston Price's book because I thought I could cure my tooth decay. It then happened by accident, with zero expectation of this happening, that all of my anxiety disorders basically disappeared. And it was really it was months after the anxiety disorders disappeared that I realized that they disappeared. I actually forgot that I had them. Yeah. So I realized at one moment when I was working in the dining hall again, and I watched this guy pick up a stack of plates to take one from the middle, and I looked at the guy with this weird look, and I'm like, what the hell is that guy doing, in my head? And I walked away, and about 30 seconds later, it suddenly struck me that 2 or 3 months before that, I always did that every time I took the plate, because I was afraid what might be on the top of the of the top plate. And I was much worse than that. I would often spend 20 minutes trying to find a glass to drink out of that I considered clean enough. And all of that had disappeared, but I didn't remember that I was doing that a couple months before until I saw that guy do it. So it was really an unexpected total shocker that diet could have such a profound influence on mental health. Weston Price did kind of allude to that in his book, but it wasn't anywhere near his central focus, and I had no expectation of that happening. So that gave me, going into it for tooth decay and coming out of it with revolutionized mental health gave me a very deep appreciation of the effect of nutrition that I would never have had without that experience.
Yeah, I mean, it's like I think Paul Chek calls it being the wounded doctor yourself. That it's something that you've gone through, and it's one of the things that we say, like especially in the natural health world. It's when you heal anything, well, you can't just heal one thing. Once you start healing one thing, the body takes over and it heals everything. Once you start eating right, getting your life in check, everything takes care of itself, and that's it's very, what you just said is very common, that people forget. Oh my God, that used to be me, or I used to have that, and because they forget what it used to be like, because it becomes being healthy becomes their new normal, and they just forget. So it's that's quite a good little story you got there to share, because I reckon a lot of people will actually identify with that. Oh my God, yeah, I remember when I used to do that, because it's what happens once you start to get healthy. It just becomes your new way of life. So with Weston Price, talking about obviously his research, he was a dentist. He went and studied like the Maasai tribes, Inuits, and he found that they had a very high fat diet. And today, I mean, even today, people will still associate high fat diets, high saturated fat diets with heart disease. Even though a lot of research goes to the contrary. What was it? I mean, you studied yourself. Was that a completely different approach to what you were doing before? Was it like 100? Was it flipped on its head, 180 degrees?
Well, Weston Price wasn't really concerned with fat so much as he was concerned with fat-soluble vitamins. Mm-hmm. And so he studied groups all over the world and found a lot of different traditional diets, but he identified the common theme that although fat-soluble vitamins are not distributed very widely in the food supply because there's really a handful of specific foods that are rich in them, all of the groups that he studied, no matter where they were across the globe, no matter what the proportion of plant and animal foods was in their diet, had specific, explicit cultural conventions around obtaining foods that were high in fat-soluble vitamins. Now, those groups, they didn't know what fat-soluble vitamins were, but they knew that certain foods were worth going out of their way to obtain, even when it required a lot of work to get them, because they couldn't be healthy without them. And Price identified these as 4 categories. In one category, he put dairy and egg yolks. In another category, he put the animal life of the sea, so fish and shellfish. In another category, he put organ meats. And in a 4th category, he put insects. So all of the groups he studied went out of their way to obtain at least one of those things, and maybe several of them. Probably none of them went out of their way to obtain all 4 of them. And there are groups like the Inuit who ate a very high-fat diet and fell into that category. There were other groups that ate, even the Maasai ate a much lower fat diet than the Inuit, because although they specialized in producing meat and milk and blood from their own cattle, they lived surrounded by other tribes that they would trade with for starches and other foods like that. But, the Maasai fell into that category as well. So that was completely 180 opposite from what I was doing because I was a vegan. Mm-hmm. And but so there were kind of 2 things that struck me about that. One was that as a vegan, I thought I was eating a more nutrient-dense diet because I honestly, I didn't know a lot about nutrition. And I think if you don't know a lot about nutrition, you just hear buzzwords and you hear basic intuitive concepts. So I associated milk with calcium. I associated meat with protein. I associated fruits and vegetables with vitamins. I never, it never even occurred to me that there were vitamins in meat that you couldn't get in plant foods, like vitamin B12, for example. Even though that's a basic nutrition fact, you don't grow up with that kind of knowledge. You grow up with just kind of the concepts that come out of public health campaigns, like milk, it does a body good. Why? It has calcium.
Milk's good for your bones, sort of thing.
So, right. So I, the idea that there were vitamins that you needed to get from animal foods was nowhere in my conceptual framework at that point. And so that was brand new to me. And it was a shocker as a vegan because once again, I thought veganism was more nutrient dense, and here are these vitamins and I'm not getting it all because I'm a vegan. But the other thing was even when I was not a vegan, or even all my omnivorous friends and family and associates, they weren't focusing on shellfish. They weren't focusing on organ meats. None of them were intentionally eating insects. So what Price was really doing was not just showing me the errors of veganism, but he was also showing me the less severe errors of common omnivory, which is the animal foods that we're eating aren't nutrient dense enough because we're just eating the boneless, skinless chicken breast, and we're not eating the liver, and we're often not eating the egg yolks, and we maybe are drinking milk, but it's low-fat milk, and we are, maybe eating some fish, but not much, and not shellfish. So it really stepped up nutrition to a new standard that I had never had even before veganism.
And it's, well, some of the things you said there is well, when you're talking about, we're going to go into, which is cholesterol, when you're talking about those foods there, things like, I would say mother's milk, for example, it's the highest cholesterol food on earth, pretty sure. Then you're looking at shellfish, high in cholesterol. In the UK, I think we're the biggest exporters of offal meat in the world. And it's just something that we don't like to eat. I mean, we have liver, but when it comes to heart, lungs, things like that, we just don't eat it. Whereas a lot of different countries in the world do. And I think the people are, as you mentioned there, there's certain nutrients you get in these foods that you can't get anywhere else. But it's something that I always try to tell people, and to get them to try different things, because first of all, if a lot of these foods, a lot of people have about 12 foods in rotation. They don't step outside of that. So when you start introducing different foods, it obviously the body starts to produce different reactions, different enzymes, which is great. But also, it just it's getting them a whole different complex of vitamins, nutrients in their body, which is great. So when it comes to that, Chris, because something that we always want to move on to, because it's a big thing when it comes to cholesterol. Now, do we have to be scared of saturated fat, Chris? I mean, you see adverts on TV, still talking about margarine, still talking about cholesterol-lowering drinks, who say high cholesterol is a risk factor, and saturated fat is a risk factor for coronary heart disease. Is this true? And if so, what can we do about it?
Well, I think the upside is a lot of people don't watch TV commercials anymore. I don't watch TV at all, and I think people who do are probably staring at their phone or something during the commercials and checking Facebook. But anyway, I think that you shouldn't be scared of any natural foods, and you probably shouldn't be scared of food in general. It's just not a good motivator for your choices. So I think there are reasons that some people should moderate their saturated fat, but for the most part, I think it's largely benign in its role. So we can make our own saturated fats. There's not a dietary essentiality of saturated fats. The problem, though, is that in the foods that have saturated fat or cholesterol, you're getting that from a profile of many other nutrients. So if you restrict saturated fat, you're going to eat less meat, you're going to eat fewer egg yolks. Especially if you're restricting cholesterol, you're going to eat fewer egg yolks. And as you do that, you restrict the supply of a lot of vitamins and minerals that are essential. And I think that's where you get into the real trouble.
Okay. So so there's certain foods, obviously, they're going to be dense in saturated fats and those nutrients. So when people are talking about these different diets and what you go on, I mean, people are very, very scared when it comes to cholesterol. When it comes to cholesterol, people, for example, they walk into their doctors and they get told they get high cholesterol and they get prescribed a statin. Now, over in the US, I think you have different guidelines for cholesterol. I mean, over here we get told that our cholesterol should be below 5, and that's 5 mmol, which stands for millimoles per liter of blood. Are you familiar with that at all, Chris?
Yeah, I am, but I mean, I'm familiar with millimolar. I don't know the interconversions off the top of my head, though.
Okay, no worries. So it's basically a lot of people I see who ask questions that the level of 5 now. But just in general, if I was to say to you, is when they get told this, your level should be below 5 or could be 500, whatever it is in terms of the number. Are those guidelines always? I mean, are those guidelines people should be scared of? Oh my God, my cholesterol's above 5. I mean, aren't we all biochemically different and individual? So shouldn't that all be taken with a pinch of salt?
So I just plugged this into an online calculator, and if that online calculator is correct, 5 millimoles per liter is 193 milligrams per deciliter, which is what we use in the U.S. The cutoff in the U.S. is usually 200, and so it's probably the case that the cutoff is almost the same, but they're rounding it off to make it an easy to remember round number. So it's easy to remember 5, and it's easy to remember 200. So I think that's probably why there's a slight discrepancy. Anyway, I think there's you have to be careful here because it's easy to throw the baby out with the bathwater. Yeah. So on the one hand, I believe that the mainstream consensus view that high cholesterol levels are the cause of heart disease are wrong, but I also believe that it would be gravely it would be a serious error to just ignore high blood lipids. Mm-hmm. I also think that the ranges that are concerning are a little bit too narrow. So if you look at take the Weston Price approach. Weston Price didn't study people's blood lipids, but people later took Weston Price's approach of studying people who don't have a disease, who are isolated from modern society, to see what their blood lipids are. And if you look at the Pacific Islands, you find across the spectrum of high-fat, low-carbohydrate diets and high-carbohydrate, low-fat diets, when people were consuming their traditional diet, they did not have heart disease. And what you find is that the main variable in cholesterol levels on those islands is driven by how much carbohydrate versus how much coconut fat people eat. So the main source of fat in all of these diets is coconut. On an island like Catawba, one of the Pacific Islands, they happen to eat less coconut than on Tokelau, another Pacific island, and more starchy tubers and fruits. On Tokelau, they do the opposite. And so what you have is on Catawba, the total fat in the diet is only 20% of calories, which is really low. But even their saturated fat is 17% of total calories, which is 50% greater than the average in the United States. Mm-hmm. I'm not sure what the average in the UK is, but it's probably fairly similar to the US, I'm imagining. And so their saturated fat is high because all their fat comes from coconut, even though their total fat is low. But on Tokelau, their total fat is really high. It's over 50% of calories, but it's almost all saturated fat because it comes from coconut. So their saturated fat is over 50% of their total calories, which is the highest ever recorded in the world, which is over 5 times or over 4 to 5 times what people in the US and UK are eating. Mm-hmm. And they're free of heart disease as well. But now, if you look at their blood lipids are higher on Tokelau than they are on Catawba, and that's very clearly rooted in the fact that on Tokelau they're eating less carbohydrate, more total fat, and more saturated fat. So, but the thing is, if you look at people on Tokelau, the average cholesterol level for a male doesn't really get higher than 220 in any age range. For women in the postmenopausal period, or the presumably postmenopausal period based on age, it does peak up a little bit higher, up to about 250 or so. And in any of these groups during pregnancy, the blood lipids rise as well. But like, let's take a man as our first example. 220 is not that much higher than 200. But if 220 can be associated with complete freedom from heart disease in the context of a traditional diet and lifestyle and a diet rich in saturated fat, then it's a bit bizarre to say, well, if you're 205, you should be on a statin. Right. And similarly with women, I think for younger women, it's very similar to men. But if you're in the postmenopausal period or you're pregnant, I would see, rising up to 250 as not necessarily harmful, because we can trace that back to the blood lipids on Tokelau as an example. Now, we have to be real careful here because people in the United States or the UK don't have the same genetics as the Pacific Islands. They don't have the same diet as the Pacific Islands. They don't have the same lifestyle as the Pacific Islands. And the reason that their blood lipids are high might not be the same as on the Pacific Islands. So we also can't be ideological and say just because someone doesn't have heart disease on Tocolau at 220 means you will not get heart disease at 220. So I think it's important to appreciate that the high cholesterol level isn't an intrinsic driver of the risk of heart disease, but at the same time, to not throw the baby out with the bathwater, I think we also have to consider, well, why is it's an absolutely true fact that the higher your cholesterol is in the United States or the UK, the greater your probability of having heart disease in the future is. That's been shown over dozens of thousands of people in dozens of prospective studies. Prospective study means you measure the cholesterol level and then you wait and see what happens later. And that's just a true fact. So why is that true? Well, part of the reason that you can have high blood lipids, and in fact the dominant reason for most people in the US and UK to have high blood lipids, is that the degree to which you're clearing the cholesterol from the blood is decreased. That's not a good thing, because when that happens, there's a lot of other things in the lipoproteins, which are the vehicles that the cholesterol travels in the blood. There's a lot of other things there. So Chris, all your fats. So Chris,
go ahead. I just want to do this just so people understand. So this is where you're talking about. You said the lipoprotein. So this is where people they talk about HDL and LDL. Okay. Is this correct? Yeah. So you get your higher density lipoproteins, your lower density lipoproteins, and people always talk about HDL being the good, LDL being the bad. Just so people, just before we go into that, just because people might think, oh, what's this? For the audience out there, these aren't actually cholesterol, are they? As you said before, they are the vehicles which deliver the cholesterol. Is this correct?
That's right.
Yeah.
So, yep. So in these lipoproteins, you are not just carrying cholesterol, you're also carrying all your fat-soluble vitamins, you're carrying other fat-soluble things that you make in the body that need to go from one place to another. So if you are not taking those up into your cells, and that's the reason that they're rising in the blood, then you're not delivering the nutrients to your tissues. That's not a good thing. But also, the longer they spend in the blood, the more likely they are to get damaged. And all the research on what actually causes heart disease to develop shows that those lipoproteins getting damaged is actually what contributes to heart disease. So although having more cholesterol in the blood is not going to drive heart disease, having more cholesterol in your blood may be an indication that your metabolism of these lipoproteins is slowing. And if that's the case, you want to fix that, because the slowing of that metabolism does contribute to heart disease, and it does compromise your health in other ways. And so when I look at blood cholesterol levels, I try to figure out whether that's the case. And some signs are if your total cholesterol is elevated, and so you just mentioned the difference between LDL and HDL. One thing that happens when your metabolism of these lipoproteins slows is that the cholesterol in the LDL increases and the cholesterol in the HDL decreases. That is if you see, so an easy way to get a sense whether that's happening is you just take the total cholesterol and you divide it by the HDL cholesterol, and you look at the ratio. A ratio of around 3, maybe 3 to 4, but I think it's closer to 3 and below, is associated with the lowest risk of heart disease, and it also is an indication that your cholesterol metabolism is pretty fast. So even if your cholesterol is a little bit on the high range, like let's say someone has 220 or 230 or 240, and their total to HDL cholesterol ratio is 3, that's a sign that the reason that their cholesterol is a little on the high end is probably not because their metabolism of those lipoproteins is slowing, and I would consider that fairly low risk. But if you look at let's say you have a male who has 250 for total cholesterol and their total to HDL cholesterol ratio is 7, then that guy is probably in some tough shape, because first of all, his total cholesterol is significantly higher than even what you would find in males on Tokelau, who have the highest blood cholesterol levels out of any indigenous population studied, and who eat the most saturated fat in the entire world. Second of all, a ratio of 7 indicates that his metabolism of those particles is really slow. And third of all, I bet you anything that if you measured his testosterone, it's probably low, because one of the things you do with cholesterol when you take it into cells is you convert it to other good things like sex hormones. And if your metabolism of cholesterol is that slow, you're probably slowing down your production of sex hormones too. So all of these, that's what I mean by not throwing the baby out with the bathwater. You don't want to be afraid of cholesterol, and you don't want to assume that you need to be on a statin because it's just out of the range. But that doesn't mean that you should ignore it and not use it to try to understand what's going on in a person's body and how can you improve their health.
Yeah, 100%. And this is a few things that you got. This is why you can go so many different ways with this, Chris. So you mentioned there, right, because the general consensus, or say public opinion, would be that fat blocks arteries. And that fat comes from eating saturated fat foods, which raises your cholesterol, which then blocks your arteries. So, for people out there, can you just explain? Because you mentioned as well there about sex hormones, which I want to get into later on, and I also want to talk about polyunsaturated fats and statins and everything. But you just mentioned something there, so I want to touch on it. For people out there, what's the difference between eating saturated fat and, as you said, having the profile in your blood, like lipids in your blood, cholesterol, blood cholesterol versus cholesterol you're eating from your diet? How does that differ? Because they're not intrinsic to each other, are they? One doesn't affect the other intrinsically.
Sure, and eating saturated fat in your diet and eating cholesterol in your diet is also not the same thing. So if you take the Pacific Island diets, they're eating a lot of coconut. There's zero cholesterol in coconut oil because cholesterol is only found in animal foods. So you're getting cholesterol from foods like egg yolks, foods like liver, to a lesser extent other organ meats, to a even lesser extent dairy fat and things like that, animal fats in general, tallow, like any of those meat. All those things are going to have some cholesterol. But saturated fat and cholesterol in the diet are separable because you do have some foods like beef that are fairly high in cholesterol and fairly high in saturated fat, but they're not perfectly correlated. Even as you go from beef to egg yolks, you have less saturated fat in the egg yolk and you have way more cholesterol. And then you go to something like coconut, you have the highest saturated food on the planet and zero cholesterol. So those are two totally different things, and they need to be discussed separately. Now, the question then becomes, does eating cholesterol impact your blood cholesterol? And then a completely separate question is, does eating saturated fat impact your blood cholesterol? Well, eating cholesterol does not necessarily impact your cholesterol, but it might, depending on who you are. The reason that it might not, and actually this is the most common thing, so about two-thirds of people will experience practically no change at all in their blood cholesterol in response to eating 3 or 4 egg yolks a day, and which is a lot of cholesterol. And the reason is that your body has what's called homeostasis. Homeostasis is a concept in biology that says when you want a stable level of something and something provokes a change in that system, you respond with changes that bring it back to that stable level. So in cholesterol homeostasis, when you input cholesterol into the system and your body wants a stable level of cholesterol, it reacts with things that lower the level of cholesterol back to normal. Right. So you need about 2 grams of that's 2,000 milligrams of cholesterol a day to be made in your body. And so even if you eat 3 or 4 egg yolks, maybe you're getting like 12, maybe you're getting 50 or 60% of that. Your body has plenty of room to work with to lower its own synthesis of cholesterol and still be synthesizing more cholesterol than you ate and still have everything be normal levels. However, there are genetic differences between people in how much cholesterol you absorb from your food, how tightly that homeostatic process is regulated, and various things like that. And as a result, about 2/3 of people who eat 3 or 4 egg yolks a day will not experience any significant rise in their blood lipids, but about a third of people will experience an increase in LDL cholesterol and HDL cholesterol in roughly the same proportions so that the ratio doesn't change. And then there's about 1% of people who will have a spike in LDL cholesterol and not HDL cholesterol. So it really depends on the person how those changes occur. Now, saturated fat is a completely separate question. In general, it does depend on what you're substituting it for. So to substitute saturated fat for carbohydrate is different than to substitute saturated fat for polyunsaturated fat or monounsaturated fat. And substituting saturated fat for monounsaturated fat is probably going to have the smallest difference out of any in total cholesterol levels. But substituting saturated fat for carbohydrate will raise your cholesterol levels. Substituting saturated fat for polyunsaturated fat will raise them even further. And you can see this clearly in, for example, the Pacific Islands. As you go from Catawba, which is very high carbohydrate, low fat, where 20% fat, all coming from coconut, to Tokelau, which is over 50% of the diet coming from saturated fat from coconut, you see cholesterol levels rise. In fact, there's another island that was studied, Puka Puka, which is intermediate in the amount of coconut in the diet between those other two islands, and their blood lipids are right smack in the middle of those other two islands. So it's definitely the case that eating more saturated fat relative to most other changes that you could make in the diet is going to raise your cholesterol, but that doesn't mean that it's going to cause heart disease. So I think in most cases, for most people, trying to reduce saturated fat in their diet is not anywhere near the first step I'd do to try to reduce blood lipids. But, it's in there. It will have an effect. And I think it should be considered for some people whose blood lipids are way out of whack. So a very small proportion of people have blood lipids in excess of 300 for total cholesterol. Let's see, that in millimoles per liter, 300 is 7.758. So let's say 7.8. So if you're in the range of 7, 8, 9 millimoles per liter or 300 and plus milligrams per deciliter, you probably got serious problems and you should be doing something about that. So in someone like that, I would not be afraid to say maybe you should reduce the saturated fat in your diet.
But Chris, here's the thing I'm going to put out there. If those people who are at 300 or 7, as we said, mmol, were eating a diet that is high in saturated fat, it's high in saturated fat, but it's coming from, you said, the land. It's all non-GMO. It's organic. It is what it is. I doubt their cholesterol would be up there. Now, this is what we talk about. So that's
true, but they could have a genetic disorder or in blood lipid metabolism, or they could have a thyroid problem.
Yeah, okay. If they've got a genetic predisposition or a genetic disorder or thyroid issue, yeah. I think one of the only ones when you talk about statin, is it familial hypertension? I'm trying to think. There's one that people will say statins is okay for. I remember doing some research on it, but in general, I'm saying it's that having a diet that's rich in saturated fats, but quality fats. We're not talking about fats that have come from animals which have been fed the whole host of things that we know are not right. Sawdust pellets have been treated well, haven't been chewing. As you know, I think it's the levels of vitamins are like 500% higher in grass-fed, organically raised cows than they are in one from a CAFO, for example. Don't you think that you talk about reducing saturated fat? As you said, it would be one of the things, but the rest of it would be looking at all the other diet and lifestyle factors first.
Yeah, I completely agree with you that someone who doesn't fall into the category of a thyroid disorder or a genetic disorder is highly unlikely to have cholesterol levels over 300, over 7 millimoles per liter, right, exactly. Well, I mean, even if not, I mean, someone eating a pretty crappy diet is not going to have their blood lipids spike that high from putting butter on their toast.
Yeah.
So I think, in those cases, changing the saturated fat in the diet would probably be the fifth or sixth thing that I looked at after many other attempts failed, if in fact there's some kind of problem regulating blood lipids. But yeah, I mean, I don't think it's something that most people need to be concerned about in most cases. But you could just overwhelm the system, right? So do people drink bulletproof coffee in the UK?
Yeah, it's
okay.
A growing trend,
well,
yeah.
Right. So let's say that you went on a bulletproof coffee fast where you just ate 6 meals a day that only had bulletproof coffee, right, and you got your entire caloric intake from butter and coconut oil or something like that. Mm-hmm. Well, I could see your blood lipids raising kind of high on that.
Yeah.
So I mean, but with a little common sense emulating traditional diets, you really shouldn't see your blood lipids raising like that, no matter how much saturated fat you're eating.
Well, it's a question I'm going to put to you at the end, but I get it quite a lot, and it's something that people always say, well, I've been told these statins, what can I do? I don't want to go on them, and we'll get to that at the end. But it's something that is said, it's basically falls into the category of a lot of the way that you should be living anyway. And when it comes to that, we'll go through it. But Chris, just because after the people know Ansel Keys, he had a study about how saturated fats and cholesterol are bad for you, and there's another study called the China study come out talking about it as well. I know you've written an article all about that, sort of debunking them. The difference between because saturated fats for a long time they got bad press. Fat is bad for you. Your eggs, you can't eat the egg yolk, it's bad for you. Even though an egg white on its own is one of the most allergenic foods on the planet. So they're talking about egg yolk's being bad for you, butter's bad for you, this, that, the other. And they started to introduce polyunsaturated fats and oils, etc. Now, what are your thoughts on these polyunsaturated fats and oils? Are they good for you, or are they bad for you, and will they make you worse or better?
So polyunsaturated fats will be found in natural foods, even of animal origin, in small amounts. Mm-hmm. But traditional diets tended to have really low levels of polyunsaturated fat. So if you look at diets like the Maasai we talked about before, you look at diets like the Pacific Islands like we were talking about, polyunsaturated fat in most of those diets, maybe the Inuit is an exception because of the high marine oil intake, but polyunsaturated fats in most populations would be around 2 to 4% of calories, which is fairly low. And you're going to go way higher than that if you start eating 30 to 40% of your diet as fat coming mostly from vegetable oils made from soybean oil, canola oil, sunflower oil, safflower oil, corn oil, cottonseed oil, any of those things. Yeah. And the polyunsaturated fats in those oils are very vulnerable to a form of damage that we call oxidative damage. I think for people who don't have a chemistry background or a biology background, I think the easiest way to conceive of this is like a biological form of rust. So, you leave your bicycle out in the rain, you're going to notice that it starts to get damaged from rust. Well, same thing and actually, to make this even more intuitive, if you took a bottle of vegetable oil and you left it open on your counter for a few months, you'd notice that it would stink real bad. Yeah. And that's because it went rancid. Yeah. Yep. And that's the process of oxidative damage happening outside your body. But inside your body, that process of oxidative damage is actually accelerated because your metabolism exposes the fats to a lot of energy and oxygen metabolites that will accelerate that process over and above the how that would occur if you were leaving it out on your counter. Mm-hmm. And you also have a lot of protective factors. Your body, our bodies are designed to try to protect against that damage, and that's the main function of antioxidants that we get in the diet and a lot of biochemical pathways inside our bodies. But those protective mechanisms aren't perfect. So as your polyunsaturated fat intake increases, you become more and more vulnerable to that biological form of rust happening inside your body, which contributes to aging, which contributes to heart disease, which contributes to cancer, which contributes to most degenerative diseases. And in fact, if you look at the lipoprotein that carries cholesterol and you look at what happens as it contributes to atherosclerosis, which is the hardening of the arteries that we call heart disease, what's actually happening is the polyunsaturated fats in the membrane of that particle are suffering oxidative damage. So it's actually the oxidative damage of those polyunsaturated fats that drives heart disease. So regardless of what they do to your blood levels of cholesterol, you want to be real careful of them. And it gets even worse when you introduce other things that enhance oxidative stress. So exposure to environmental toxins enhances oxidative stress. Oxidative stress being the process that leads to oxidative damage. So smoking enhances oxidative stress. A lot of different things, that some of which are under our control, like smoking, and some of which aren't, like environmental toxins, or just aging. Oxidative stress gets worse as we age. As all these factors combine, those polyunsaturated fats become more and more dangerous, and they accumulate in your body over years, and they take years for their levels to fully decline as well. So if you're eating polyunsaturated fats right now, maybe it's not doing you any harm, but it might be setting the foundation for later when you age, later when you're not sleeping as well, later when you get sick, later when you move into a place that's more polluted. Any of those factors can then later take what you've been doing for years by consuming vegetable oils and kind of activate that damage, or take the foundation and make it actually progress into something pretty harmful to your body.
Yeah, 100%. And it's just so, just for people out there, why were these promoted as alternative healthy fats compared to what's traditionally been used? What was the thinking behind it?
They lower cholesterol.
Mm-hmm. And in your opinion, is cholesterol vital to health and vitality?
Yes.
Mm-hmm. And why would that be?
Well, if you want to see a severe case that really illustrates how impactful it is, you could look at Smith-Lumley apat syndrome, which is a genetic disorder where you can't synthesize enough cholesterol. And that gives you a really insightful picture into all the things that cholesterol does. So what happens is their digestion fails. They can't absorb fats in their diet. That's because cholesterol is made into bile acids. They have hormonal problems. That's because cholesterol is made into all the steroid hormones that regulate that include the sex hormones, but also hormones that regulate your blood pressure and your blood sugar and your water balance. They have neurological problems that include various forms of retardation, failure to thrive, visual problems. Why? Because cholesterol is, if you look at the brain's 2% of your body weight, has about a quarter of your body's cholesterol. So the brain is incredibly enriched in cholesterol. Turns out cholesterol is an important for the coatings of neurons. And in fact, the supply of cholesterol in the brain is the limiting factor for forming synapses, which are the connections between neurons that form the basis of learning and memory and cognitive performance. So cholesterol is doing all kinds of things that are absolutely essential to life and health. And actually, if you look at Smith-Lumley apat syndrome, the incidence of that is really low in the population, and it's not because the genetics are uncommon. About 1 to 3% of the population carries the genes for that. And so if two people who each have that gene, so let's say in the UK probably 1% of women and 1% of men carry that gene. If that 1% mates with that 1%, they produce the genetics, the two copies of the defective gene that will lead to Smith-Lumley apat syndrome. But the incidence of that syndrome is way less than what you would expect from 1% mating with 1%. And that's because almost every case of conception never makes it to term. And so almost all of the embryos or fetuses that have this syndrome die and never never born. And so that shows you how essential cholesterol is just to be alive.
Yeah, I know. I sort of set you up there, but that was the whole point. Because I wanted you to get just to understand, because that's so important for people to understand. Cholesterol gets a bad rep, and it's so important for our health. As you mentioned earlier, it's so important that if you're not eating enough, your body starts to make it itself. And as you said, our brain is cholesterol. I mean, Dr. Kowal, if you know Dr. Kowal, have you heard of him before, Chris?
I'm not sure.
Okay, he talks about Dr. Leonard Kowal. He talks about people. He says this is true, but he says a lot of people, they don't die because they've got too much cholesterol. They die because haven't got enough, because it's in their body, can't, as you said, produce all those reactions that it goes through, especially the sex hormone. It's a precursor to every sex hormone, which is incredibly important. So when you just move on to statins there, because that was a brilliant answer. I've actually got that Smith-Lumley opposite syndrome up, and I'll be looking into that myself. It's the first time I've heard of that syndrome, so really interesting. When it comes to people taking statins, Chris, I mean, around this is a little bit of research. I put a post out there the other day. So at the moment, around 100 million people are taking statins, and they've been shown, research has shown that they damage the heart, they block the production of vital nutrients, they inhibit vitamin K2 and selenium. They inhibit the heart's ability to strengthen after exercise. They cause type 2 diabetes, which increases the risk of heart disease. What are your thoughts on them? Who should be using them, if anyone?
Well, I think the big problem with statins is twofold. So first of all, the reference ranges for cholesterol levels are too narrow, and that leads to people having problems fixed. You don't necessarily have a problem. But more to the point, I think the second problem with them is the real big one, which is they're used as a first line of defense. Mm-hmm. And what people should be doing if their blood lipids are out of the range is first looking at, what are the ratios? How likely is this a problem? Does anything need to be done? And if so, the answer to that should be first to look at diet and lifestyle factors that can help improve your cholesterol metabolism, and statins should be a last resort. So I don't know what the true incidence of side effects is. I think that's highly controversial because on the one hand, there's a lot of controlled studies showing that it's pretty low, but on the other hand, they basically weed out anyone who would be vulnerable to side effects when they do those studies, unlike when they're prescribed, where they just give them to everyone with high cholesterol. So, but the side effects are real. You can get serious side effects from them. I agree that there's fairly decent evidence that they might contribute to diabetes. I don't think they're that damaging to the heart, but they do impair your synthesis of coenzyme Q10 and a specific form of vitamin K2 called MK4, as you alluded to, which is bad for the heart. So, I mean, I would, if I were on a statin, which will probably never happen, but if I were on a statin, I would be using a cocktail of nutrients to try to compensate for some of those effects. I really doubt that if you take a statin and you take some vitamin K2 and some coenzyme Q10 with it, I really doubt it's going to destroy your heart tissue. But I also think that the heart disease lowering effects of statins are also real. Are they overhyped? Yes. Are they overhyped without considering the side effects adequately? Yes. But I think there are cases where it makes sense to use the statin, and one of those cases would be, which you also alluded to earlier, genetic disorders such as familial hypercholesterolemia. And I think that in that case, I don't think it necessarily means you have to have a statin, but I think it has to be a tool in your kit when you're looking at that, because although I do believe that you could treat it with diet, which would be a low fat, low cholesterol, high carbohydrate diet, a lot of people aren't going to eat that way. And, there are some downsides to eating that way as well, because certain nutrients it gets harder to get. So I think that I am not 100% against them, but I just think they're very much overused.
Yeah, same as antibiotics. So if people went into their doctor and the doctor said, we're going to do, we tested your cholesterol and we find it's high. What would be the questions that they should ask? And if the doctor says have a statin, what should they say to the doctor before they took a statin?
Well, I don't want to tell people what to say to their doctor, and I don't want to tell people to avoid their doctor's advice. But I'll answer that from a different perspective. Okay. So I'll answer the question: how would I evaluate my blood lipids if this were me, and what would I do about it if I thought there was cause for concern? So first of all, I would look at the total to HDL cholesterol ratio. I think that in someone without diabetes, where triglycerides can become more significant in the evaluation, the total to HDL cholesterol ratio is a very good indicator of future risk for heart disease and the general health and speed of cholesterol metabolism. And so if the ratio is close to 3, I really wouldn't be concerned unless the total were really, really high. So if the total were in great excess of 250, for example, if it's over 300, hold on a second, I need a sip of water.
No worries.
So if the cholesterol were in great excess of 250, like say 280, 300, I would still be concerned. And if the total to HDL cholesterol ratio is in great excess of 3, I would be concerned. So excuse me. So if we get to say 4, I'm not that concerned, but if we get to 5, I get pretty concerned. I'm talking about a ratio. Oh, I'm sorry, and I was giving you the milligrams per deciliter. Let's see, in the UK, like we said before, let's say as you get over 7 millimoles per liter, I would be really concerned regardless of what your ratios are. But for the ratios are going to be the same between the US and the UK, thankfully. So as you get further and further from 3, concern increases. So 5 concern is pretty high, 6 concern is really high, 7 concern for me is fairly off the charts. And what I would do is I would look at some diet and lifestyle factors. So first of all, is the person overweight or obese? If so, then what I would do is make efforts to lose weight and achieve a normal and healthy body weight. Does the person have high inflammatory markers? So, for example, is their high sensitivity C-reactive protein high? That's a marker where it should be really low. It should be way under 1. As you get over 1, it starts to get concerning. If it's like 5 or 6, you probably have either you're sick or you have some kind of disorder that the doctor needs to follow up. But if it's like 1.5 or 2, then you probably have low-grade chronic inflammation that's contributing to your cholesterol levels. You need to figure out what that is. Maybe there are a lot of things that could contribute to that. Poor lifestyle itself and being overweight all can be part of that, right? So if you look at things that lower CRP, losing weight if you're overweight, exercising if you're not exercising, stopping smoking if you smoke, increasing the diversity of plant foods in your diet, so eating more fruits and vegetables and more fibrous foods decreases your CRP. So all of those diet and lifestyle factors can be important for resolving inflammation, but you really have to work with a practitioner if you can't get it under control to test for other things. So, for example, maybe your CRP is high because you have intestinal inflammation that's driving systemic inflammation, and there are all kinds of problems in the gut that go way beyond a discussion about cholesterol that, if they're present, could be influencing your blood lipids. So I would look at those things. If the person is eating a really high cholesterol or a really high fat diet, then I think that person should consider replacing fat with carbohydrate. And I don't mean eating sugar, and I don't mean eating cake. I just mean maybe drink less bulletproof coffee, or eat less stacks of butter, and then replace or less added fat in general, and replace that with healthy starches. So properly prepared grains, if you tolerate them well, meaning sprouted or fermented, starchy tubers, fruits and legumes and things like that. And another factor that can be big is stress, right? So if you have really poor stress management, if you have a lot of emotional stress or work stress, if you are fatigued all the time, you have signs that your adrenals are shot, so to speak, in the colloquial sense. Any of those things need to be addressed through lifestyle changes, better sleep, meditation, stress coping mechanisms, developing your circadian rhythm properly, meaning getting more regular sleep, getting more regular light exposure in the morning, getting rid of the heavy blue lights from artificial lighting at night and things like that. All those different kinds of things can be important parts of what's contributing to poor health. And of course, the king of all of these is the thyroid. So if your blood lipids are way out of whack, you could have a thyroid disorder. And in fact, if you go back before the era of cholesterol-lowering drugs and before the era of seeing high cholesterol as a sign of heart disease, high cholesterol was taken as a sign of low thyroid activity, and it was the standard treatment to prescribe thyroid medicine on the basis of high cholesterol levels. Unfortunately, that practice fell by the wayside when some people were making errors in the dose and wound up killing some people with what should essentially be seen as malpractice, but that kind of made mainstream medicine see that practice as dangerous, and it got abandoned. But it's still the case that the primary regulator of your cholesterol levels is your thyroid. And so screening for thyroid disorders can be important. Getting the right nutrients that support thyroid function, especially iodine and selenium, and even carbohydrate is important for thyroid function. So again, I think that's one of several reasons why if someone's eating a real high-fat diet, nothing necessarily wrong with that, but if their blood lipids are way out of whack and it looks like they're not metabolizing their cholesterol properly, I think replacing fat with carbohydrate can be beneficial, both because that has a direct effect on improving cholesterol metabolism in some people, and also because it can have an indirect effect by supporting your thyroid function.
100%. And this is for you guys listening out there, you know, if you've been and you've got a test recently saying that your cholesterol is high, you'll know whether you're doing everything that Chris has mentioned there. You'll know whether you're getting enough sleep. You'll know whether you're overly stressed. If you're getting enough, if you're doing any meditation or any sort of qigong, you'll know if you're eating right. You'll know if you're getting enough movement, exercise, hydration. You'll know if you're doing all those things. And I'd probably say for 95% of you out there, if you and you've got this problem, you probably know that there's some changes that you can make, because generally, as you say, people are living out of sync with Mother Nature's laws, and it's just things that we do because we're in a world that's constantly on the go. We're all far too much yang, like positive energy, putting work out there, staying up late, as Chris said, there under far too much blue light a lot of the time, and all these things contribute. And wherever your genetic predisposition to disease is, especially if it comes up with heart disease, then it's going to be a problem. So take that into massively into account before you start taking. As to say, as we're not doctors, we can't give medical advice, but if it was me, it's something that I'd do, would definitely be looking at my diet and lifestyle factors first, as I think Chris has mentioned there. Thanks a lot for that, Chris. I know you've got to go because we've kept you for a little while here. Is there anything else you'd like to add to that before we leave?
No, I think I'm good. I would just say if people want to really follow up some places where I've kind of succinctly put my protocols for dealing with blood lipids, just Google Chris Masterjohn cholesterol and those things will pop right up.
Yep, that's no worries. I'll be putting all that on the pre and the post little intro and outro of the show, so it will be good. People will be there to find you, Chris. Thanks very much. We want to get you, because I know you've got a few other things that you got in the pipeline at the moment. Aren't you doing a few different little projects away from cholesterol?
Yeah, I work on all kinds of things related to health and nutrition, and right now I'm doing a class on energy metabolism, how we basically for people who want to up their understanding at a technical level, who actually do want to learn the technical stuff, even if they don't have a technical background, I'm doing a class on the biochemistry of energy metabolism right now. But I also do a lot of other things. I have a podcast, Mastering Nutrition. Each time I come out with an episode, it's a full deep dive into some topic on nutrition, always a different one. I do a lot of stuff on fat-soluble vitamins. I got something on creatine coming up shortly, and just lots of stuff. So check me out.
Will do. And we'll try and get you back on the show at a later date to try and talk about some of those things. It's always interesting to check back in and see what you're doing. But thank you very much, Chris. Have a great rest of your day in New York, and we'll hopefully speak soon.
Thanks for having me on, Ryan.
No worries, mate. Bye-bye. So, guys, that was episode 41 of the Revive Yourself podcast. Done and dusted. Now, I know you guys would have learnt a lot from that. Cholesterol is such a big topic, something that everyone always talks about. Oh, my cholesterol's high, do I need statins? HDL, LDL, and we covered a lot in that. So, as I was mentioned, if you want any more information, any more questions, give me a message at www.reviveyourself.co. You can hit me up with an email at ryan@reviveyourself.co. Any questions for Chris, head on over to his website, chrismasterjohnphd.com. But I hope, as I said before, it's answered a lot of your questions, and it's meant that the whole fact about blood cholesterol and overall cholesterol and getting scaremongering, etc., there's no need for it. Once you take care of your lifestyle, your diet, everything else falls into place. So there's a lot of good information there. As always, guys, anyone who's struggling with gut issues, head on over to www.reviveyourself.co and join our 3-4 day mini course. Any chronic issue it helps with, especially gut issues, can help a lot. Also, follow us at revive_yourself on Instagram, and we're at Facebook/Revive Natural Health. As I said before, all the articles are at www.reviveyourself.co. Lots of good episodes coming up, guys. So that's us for today. Otherwise, as always, stay happy, stay healthy, and I'll speak to you soon.
If you're struggling with gut issues, such as gas, bloating, constipation, diarrhea, indigestion, heartburn, and want to finally be able to eat the foods you love without the crippling after effects, then don't forget to head over to reviveyourself.co and pick up your free copy of The Healing Health Paradigm today.